Evening to all of you. Thank you, Sumit. Thank you, Swapnesh, Preetham sir, and BOA for giving me this opportunity to discuss about fluorescent angiography and ICG in today's meeting. So, without wasting any further time, I'll be starting with my presentation. Since I have to speak for 1 hour, so let's discuss this more in detail because I know this topic is like you can keep on speaking on and on and on. It won't. So let's, if anybody has a doubt in any between, you can interrupt in between or send a question. We will definitely try to answer them as much as possible. So starting with the presentation, going with the evolution of FFA. So in 1871, von Bayer first synthesized fluorescein. In 1955, the fundus camera with an electronic flash was first invented by Zeiss. In 1960, the fluorescent angioscopy was first performed by MacLean and Mommy. In 61, the first FFA was done by Novotny and Alvis. And in 1966, the concept of stereoscopic photography was introduced by Allen. So introducing you to the concept of FFA, it has become an essential technique for research studies, clinical trials, and routine diagnosis of retinal and choroidal disorders. It provides a valuable addition to the ophthalmoscopy and slit lamp biomicroscopy techniques. It was never intended to replace these techniques, but it can clearly amplify and give additional information to us. So going first with the definition, what does FFA mean? Fundus fluorescent angiography is basically a photographic surveillance of fluorescent dye across the retinal and choroidal vasculature by serial fundus photography performed in rapid sequence after intravenous injection of the dye. It basically provides us three types of information. First, it shows the flow characteristics in the blood vessels as the dye reaches and circulates through the retina and choroid. It records the fine details of the RP and the retinal circulation that may not otherwise be visible, and it provides the clear picture of retinal vessels and an assessment of their functional integrity. So what is the principle of FFA? Sodium fluorescent is a hydrocarbon that responds to a light energy between 465 and 490 nanometers, and it will fluorescent at the wavelength of 520 to 530 nanometers. As we'll be discussing later, fluorescence is a property of a substance to get excited when stimulated by a light of particular wavelength and to emit a light of a higher wavelength after getting excited. So this excitation wavelength, the type that is absorbed and changed is blue, and the resultant fluorescence which is emitted is green yellow. So if blue light at 465 to 490 nanometer is directed to an unbound sodium fluorescein, it will emit a light that appears green yellow, that is around 520 to 530 nanometer. That is explained in this photograph. The same thing what I discussed, that fluorescence is a property of a substance to absorb light energy at a lower wavelength and emit light at a higher wavelength in the presence of continuous excitation. That is where fluorescence gets differentiated from luminescence. Okay? Luminescence is a property where the substance can emit light of higher wavelength without continuous excitation, while in fluorescence you need excitation to emit a higher wavelength. So in this picture, you can clearly see that when light is passed through blue filters, it gets absorbed, and after getting reflected from the sodium fluorescein, the green filter, the blue light is blocked, and the green light is the yellow-green light goes and is reflected on the screen, which we see on our FFA screen. So let's discuss about the dye in detail. What basically is sodium fluorescein? It is an organic dye, the molecular weight being 376 daltons. 80% of this dye is bound to albumin and 20% is unbound and responsible for the fluorescence. So the dye absorbs light in a blue-orange of the visible spectrum with absorption peak at 490 nanometer, and it emits light at 530 nanometer. So here a very important point which we have to remember is that fluorescence is 80% bound and 20% is unbound and free. This is different from ICG, which we'll be discussing later, which is around 98% bound and only 2% of it is free. Now it is this 20% which we see is responsible for the image which we see on FFA. This dye is metabolized by the liver and is excreted by the kidneys. Most of the dye is cleared within 24 hours, and the patient should be warned that their urine will appear orange during this time. This is a very important thing which we tend to forget many times, that the patient has to be told that after the procedure his urine is going to remain around yellowish orange or greenish orange for around 24 to 48 hours, and it's a normal thing and there's nothing to worry about. So regarding the dye usually is available in two concentrations, either 5 ml of 10% or 3 ml of 20% dye is injected as a bolus into the vein Preferably the antecubital vein is preferred because it is the most accessible. However, in patients who have very thin veins and it is not, or if the antecubital vein is blocked, the next obvious choice is the veins on the forearm, preferably at the wrist. The other materials required is a scalp vein set of 22 or 23 gauge and a disposable syringe of 5 ml. Cotton spirit swabs and micropores as usual. So what are the adverse effects of these dye? In very mild cases, we have seen patients reporting nausea, vomiting, and pruritus. Moderate symptoms seen in 1.5% of patients is urticaria, syncope, and others. While very severe adverse effects, which are seen in only 0.05% of people, are respiratory arrest, cardiac arrest, and seizures, which can also cause death. So since though there's a very small chance of serious side effects, but we have to be prepared. So always make sure that whenever you're planning to do an FFA, we have an emergency tray containing at least a vial of injection hydrocortisone, vial of injection Avil, injection adrenaline, an MSET, oxygen cylinder with a mask, along with an intubation set. Without this emergency tray being available as a standby, you should never proceed with the procedure. Preferably in patients who are high risk, like those who have a history of cardiac illness or a history of stroke in the past, who have recently undergone angioplasty. Preferably you have a standby anesthetist who's there, so that in cases when the need arises, you can immediately call him. That always make sure that the team involved in undertaking this procedure should have a reasonable knowledge about the immediate management of these emergencies and resuscitation. Since FFA is an invasive procedure, remember that if you don't have a team, you can't do this procedure alone. It's not a standalone procedure. If you don't have a backup team, avoid this procedure as much as possible. Now, what are the contraindications of FFA? There are very few. First is obviously a known allergy of fluorescein dye in the past, previous episode of anaphylaxis during FFA, pregnancy, though there is not a reported complications, but avoid as much as possible. Severe renal impairment, patient having very high creatinine levels and who's not on dialysis, usually you should be a little bit cautious. Though there are reports that patients who are on dialysis, you can safely perform FFA in them. And even for patients who have mild to moderate renal impairment, like around creatinine levels of 2 to 3 milligram, in such patients also you can go ahead, as has been told by nephrologists, because the quantity of dye which we are using in fundus fluorescein angiography is quite less compared to what we use in cardiac angiography. Cardiac angiography, the quantity is around 20 ml, while here we are injecting just 3 ml. So that minuscule dose is usually can be tolerated even by a mild to moderately impaired kidneys. Apart from that, patients who are having a recent history of cerebrovascular accidents, myocardial infarction, unstable angina, and heart diseases, arrhythmia, or those with pacemakers, you should avoid it as much as possible. Or if you have to do it, have an anesthetist as a standby. Now, before proceeding with the procedure, let's understand the anatomic and physiological considerations of the FFA. Choroidal circulation. The fluorescein freely leaks out of the fenestrated choroidal capillaries and from there to the Bruch's membrane. However, the tight junctions between the RP cell prevents the dye reaching from the retina. The retinal endothelial cells are joined by tight junctions which prevent leakage of the fluorescein into the retina. This constitutes the blood-retinal barrier. Any leakage from the retinal vessel is abnormal. So you have to understand that the fluorescein dye is able to pass through the large and the medium choroidal vessels, but it is not able to pass through that, but it is able to pass through the fenestrated choriocapillaries because there is a lot of gap between the endothelials. It is also able to cross the Bruch's membrane, but it is the RP which arrests the further leakage of the dye. Because of the tight RP cells, the fluorescein is not able to cross that barrier, and that is what is explained here, which constitutes as the blood-retinal barrier. So now, before proceeding with the interpretation and all, let's just in short discuss the instrumentation. FFA is an extension of fundus photography in all its aspects, including instrumentation and techniques. Hence, the instrumentation and technique has to be more advanced than a simple fundus photography. Here in the photo, what is shown is a Topcon fundus camera, which is not a very recent model, obviously, but this is an ideal on which we had usually learned our angiographies. So as you can see, that there are different controls like the eyepiece, the selection lever, the focusing knob, the astigmatism control. This aperture are for the small, normal, and dilated pupils. This is the chin rest, this is the headrest, and this is the eyepiece. Then this is the joystick for moving the machine. This is for viewing the illumination control. This is the FA viewing illumination control timer and the barrier. This is the lock to arrest the movement of the machine, and this is the flat intensity control. You can increase and decrease it from here. This is the eyepiece. This is the front view. You can adjust, and this is the joystick which we have already discussed. So before you proceed with the, always have a checklist. In this checklist, what you have to see is the pupillary dilatation adequate? Is the patient comfortably seated and cooperative? Are you and your accommodation relaxed and seated comfortably? Have you made a mental plan of areas to be studied and sequence of study? Are you familiar with the camera you are about to use? Is the reticle set to sharp focus? Is the illumination ring within the pupillary aperture? Is your viewing illumination too bright, or isn't your viewing illumination too low? Why you need to have this checklist is because once you push in the dye, the total time in which you have to capture the images is around 8 to 10 minutes. After that, the dye usually escapes the retinal circulation. If you don't have this checklist previously made, then once you start doing the procedure, once you have injected the dye, then you can't keep time on checking all these things. If the patient is not comfortable or you are not comfortable, then most of the time you're wasting in adjusting the camera and all. So the different phases of the angiography which need to be captured are missed. So that is the reason you have a very limited time. So you have to have this checklist before you proceed with the procedure. Always make sure that you tell the patient in advance what you're going to do. Just don't do it blindly. Tell the patient that we are going to push a dye and then we are going to take a serial photographs. And what I usually do in practice is I always tell the patient that when we are going to inject the dye, you might have a little bit of nausea. Okay, in that case, then usually there is no vomiting. But if patient experiences nausea, all he has to do is take deep breaths. Okay. Once the patient is told, because this feeling is usually there for around 1 to 2 minutes. If the patient is able to handle that much, usually the nausea wears off as the time progresses. So if the patient is already aware of these things, he is mentally prepared, then the precious time is not wasted when you're capturing the photo. So once you have this checklist done, again the same thing which I had done. One important point which I missed is you have to make sure that the patient is nil orally for at least 4 hours prior to FFM. That's because though there is a less chance of vomiting happening, but since the nausea component is there, if the patient is coming with a full tummy, there is a more chance that the patient might do vomit. If the patient vomits during the procedure, then a lot of time is wasted in cleaning and all this, and you might not be able to miss the essential fix which you wanted. So always before starting the angiography, first take the color and the red field photographs. So this has to be done before the dye is injected. Once this is done, then you check whether your the IV line which you have taken is patent or not. So before pushing the dye, always first put saline to check whether it's patent or not. Once you have confirmed its patency, then only you inject the dye. Before injecting the dye, always tell the patient that now I'm going to push the dye. And if you get nausea, just take deep breaths. Start the FFA as soon as the choroidal fluorescence is seen. So the main is start the timer. When you start the timer, the moment the sister pushes the dye, after 2 to 3 seconds you can start. Why usually we wait for 2 to 3 seconds? Usually some amount of time is taken for the dye to leave the syringe and enter the circulation. So for that, usually what I do, I keep a gap of 2 to 3 seconds before starting my timer. So to establish or confirm a diagnosis, to aid in a treatment plan, or to assess the response to a treatment. So a normal, as I said before, the phases of the angiogram are dependent upon the phases through which the dye passes. The moment the dye is pushed into the vein, it first enters the choroidal circulation, from where it is the arterial phase. When it is between artery and vein, it is called the arteriovenous phase. And once it entirely reaches the retinal veins, it is the venous phase. So correspondingly, the stages are first the choroidal flush, the arterial phase, the arteriovenous phase, and the venous phase, which is again divided into early, mid, and late venous phase. And then there is a late recirculation phase also. So the choroidal phase occurs after around 10 to 15 seconds of the dye being pushed. What you can see as in the image, there are faint, patchy, irregular, scattered, interspersed islands of fluorescent filling. So can you see this? Patchy choroidal filling is there. It won't be choroidal phase. Here you can see there is hardly any dye. Here it is just started, but there is hardly any dye in the arterioles here. As we proceed to the next phase, it occurs after 1 to 3 seconds of the choroidal flush. Here you can see that the dye extends from the first appearance of the dye in arteries until the whole arterial circulation is filled. As you can see here, the entire arteries are filled with the dye. Here you can see, this is an enlarged image. What is the intravenous phase? Once there's a complete filling of the arteries and capillaries with early lamellar flow in the veins, the extent of background choroidal fluorescence increases as more dye leaks from the choriocapillaries. The lamellar flow, I think there's no. If you see this, you can see here's a lamellar flow is seen in the veins. Lamellar flow means it usually happens because the dye has not yet totally reached the veins and some amount of dye sticks to the walls of the veins. So that is why you see this lamellar pattern. Now, what is the venous phase? The venous phase is again, as I said, divided into 3 phases: the early, mid, and the late. In the early phase, the arterial filling with early lamellar venous flow is seen. In mid phase, almost complete venous filling is there. And in the late phase, obviously, the veins are filled completely, as you can see in these photos. Yeah, this is the photo I was talking about. Where you can very nicely see a lamellar flow in the veins. Now, the late phases. Late phases shows the effect of continuous recirculation, depletion, and elimination of the dye from the eye. This usually occurs around, say, 7 to 8 or to 9 minutes of the pushing the dye. Late staining of the optic nerve head is also seen.
Sir, your voice is stopped. You're not audible.
Am I visible?
Sir, yes, sir. Now
Yeah,
you're audible.
Yeah. Sorry, I think the connection was lost in between.
Yeah.
1 second. I'll just continue from the point we left. Okay, we were here. Okay, so this is a very important thing which we have to remember, that the FAZ is around to 500 microns and it always appears dark on an FFA. So a normal fluorescent angiogram usually can be either normal, abnormal, or what we can see is an artifact in there. If it is abnormal, then it could be there could be hyperfluorescence of the dye which is seen, or there could be hypofluorescence. Hypofluorescence could be because of either leakage of the dye, either cooling of the dye, staining, or it could be a transmitted hypofluorescence. And hypofluorescence could be either blocked hypofluorescence or capillary non-perfusion areas, which is non-filling. So an abnormal, when we see a hypofluorescence, is a reduction of absence of normal fluorescence. While hyperfluorescence is any abnormally light area on the positive screen of an angiogram, that is an area showing fluorescence in excess of what should be expected on a normal angiogram. So as you can, just to give you an idea of a hypofluorescence, as you can see in this is a colored fundus photograph, and in between you can see these areas of hypofluorescence surrounding this and going inferiorly along the arcade and just saddling the inferior retinal arterioles. This is a transmitted hyperfluorescence due to RP window defects, as we see many times in chronic CSCR cases. This is another example where we can see transmitted hyperfluorescence due to RP thinning and degeneration, as we see in choroiditis. Now, in this case, leakage. Okay, so basically leakage, how do we define on angiography? So any type of hyperfluorescence which we see which increases in size and density of fluorescent images is usually termed leakage. Like you can see in early photos, you can see a slight area of hypofluorescence. As the stage increase, slightly grows, increases in size and intensity. So to be a leakage. Same way here. This is another photo showing that how the leakage becomes very obvious in the later stages. This is again a picture of a CNVM showing that how gradually the CNVM is filling, and in the later phases it is showing leakage. One thing which helps you to differentiate between pooling and leakage is, apart from the size and the intensity, that leakage will always have fuzzy margins in the late stages. As you can see in the last photo, that the margins of this hyperfluorescence are not well defined and they become very fuzzy. So that is one of the ways of differentiating a pooling from a leak. You can see this picture of proliferative diabetic retinopathy, in which you can see an NV which is leaking in the late stages. Now, the second is pooling. As I was telling you, any type of hyperfluorescence which might increase in intensity but does not increase in size is usually termed to as pooling. As you can see this early fundus image and the late fundus image, the size is absolutely the same. The intensity might little bit increase, but the size usually doesn't increase. And as I said, you can see the margins in the later phases are also well defined. There are no fuzzy margins here. So that is also one of the ways of differentiating a pooling from leakage. Now staining. Staining, as I said, is a retention of the dye, which is seen in the late stages of the angiogram. It is the most obvious in the late stages, as you can see here. This is basically a macular scar, which is staining. Now coming to hypofluorescence. As I said, hypofluorescence could be because of many issues. Either it could be a block fluorescence or it could be the dye which is not reaching the surface. Now in this case, as you can see, there is a, if you see the color fundus image, there is a hemorrhage here, and the corresponding early FFA picture shows a black spot here, which remains at the later images also. This clearly shows us it's a block fluorescence. So the dye is reaching there, but because of the hemorrhages, the posterior details are obscured. So this is a classic example of a block fluorescence. This image is not very clear. We'll come to this one. This is again an example of block fluorescence. So always remember, this is why we said that the fundus image is always to be seen in conjunction with the color photograph. Because if you ignore the color photo and if you see this, you might think it's an area for non-perfusion. Sorry. So, but if you see it in conjunction with the color photograph, you'll realize that this area, there's a large pre-retinal bleed here. And that is the reason why you're not able to see this part of the fundus. So this is again an example of a block fluorescence. Again, a similar example in which a large subhyaloid heme is completely obscuring the posterior fundus details. Now here is a actual example of hypofluorescence resulting because of capillary non-perfusion areas. This is a filling defect. So here clearly you can make out there is complete loss of background colloidal fluorescence and hardly any blood is reaching this area. So this is a hypofluorescence due to a filling. Now autofluorescence, autofluorescence also you should know about, because certain conditions in the retina have a tendency to autofluoresce, like it could be optic disc drusen, astrocytic hamartoma. These things have tendency to autofluorescence. This is a showing a picture showing you how optic disc drusen autofluoresces if you have that feature in your fundus camera. This is a, just to share with you, this is a good way of differentiating an optic disc drusen from a papillary edema. In case you have a fundus, if you have an autofluorescent feature in your fundus camera, you can always use this to differentiate. Now, interpretation of an angiogram. So as we saw the different examples of hypo, and block fluorescence, so how do you interpret an angiogram? So when you see an angiogram, always first see whether it is normal or abnormal. If it is abnormal, is the abnormality black or white or mixed? What is the time characteristic of the abnormality? Means you have to see basically what phase of the angiogram you have seen the abnormality, whether it was the choroidal phase, the arterial phase, the atriovenous phase, or the venous phase. Because there are certain type of findings which will see in particular stages. Certain things will see in later stages. And what happens to the size of the abnormality? That is what I was saying, like whether it is increasing in size, whether it is increasing in intensity. So that all things you have to be kept in mind. So again, how is the distribution of the abnormal fluorescence? Whether it is patchy, whether it is homogeneous, how are the margins of the abnormality? This we have already discussed, whether it's well defined, whether it is poorly defined. How do the answers to the above correlate with the fundus picture? That is what I said. The first, always see the fundus picture should be on the left-hand side. You always have to compare the images with the fundus photo. You should never report a angiography just by looking at the FFA, because that will help you to correlate things with the color picture. So before I go for the FFA indications, remember that whenever we are interpreting an FFA, it is better to, when you do an FFA, always form a protocol that you capture the photo in a particular sequence. Don't just randomly capture the central fundus, then supratemporal quadrant, then infratemporal. No. Usually what we do, just always capture the central image first. Then you go clockwise. Take the superior image, then go at 2 o'clock, then 3 o'clock, 5 o'clock. Like that, you can capture another 9 images. Then again, same pattern with the other eye. If you follow this protocol, then there are very less chances that you will miss a particular area. So coming around, most common indications why an FFA is done is obviously the diabetic retinopathy is the commonest indication. So I'll just quickly brush over to most of the common indications. In FFA and diabetes is done usually to detect leaking microaneurysms and to look for macular ischemia. So in diabetes, these two are the most common indications. Apart from obviously, if you have a doubt whether you're missing out on a subtle NV or anything, in that case also, FFA comes out to be very handy. So this is clearly shows a large area of capillary non-perfusion, like which is very common in diabetic retinopathy. Here we can NVs and numerous paramacular leaks. So FAZ, we have already discussed about the FAZ, the irregularity of the FAZ margin, capillary budding, widening of the intercapillary spaces in the peripheral capillary bed. All these are very evident here. So macular ischemia, when do you call that you are having a macular ischemia? Is, as we discussed before, that the size of the normal FAZ is around 500 microns. So obviously we don't have some measurement tool to measure the exact size of the fovea. So normally what we do is, it is taken as a norm that the normal FAZ is usually 1/3 the size of the disc diameter. The normal disc diameter is around 1500 microns. So if you feel that the size of the FAZ is more than 1/3 or more than half the disc diameter, that usually corresponds to enlarged FAZ. Apart from the increase in the size, you also have to look for the distortion, whether the FAZ is regular, irregular, distorted. That also gives us an idea about macular ischemia. So obviously, depending on the leaks on FFA, the maculopathy in diabetic we classified as focal, diffuse, and ischemic. This is an example of focal maculopathy. I'm just showing you a very quick diagram because can't go in each and every detail because it will be otherwise a very long lecture. This is diffuse where we see extensive capillary abnormalities and long-standing leakage, which is seen late. Of the you can see a very clearly distorted macula here. Another point which is not to be forgotten is the FAZ size is usually measured in the early frames. Okay, so make sure that within the first 1 minute and the very early phase you measure the size of the FAZ, because later what might happen if you have small microaneurysms, they will start leaking and that will not give you a correct assessment of whether your FAZ is enlarged, distorted or not. So always look for the early frames are important. Here you can very nicely see IRMAs. One of the also uses of FFA is to differentiate between IRMAs and NVs. Many times clinically, especially those who are new into practice will find it very clinically difficult whether it's an NV or an IRMA. In that case, you can, if you are in doubt, you can always go for an FFA if it's available to you. This is early PDR. You can see a nice network of NV frond here, which in the late images is leaking very profusely. Again, a picture of a PDR. In the right eye, it's quite obvious, but in the left eye, as you can see, the left eye doesn't look that scary, but if you see the FFA, you can see numerous leaks. So this is one of the also indications that whenever you see one eye having a frank PDR and other eye you feel is not that affected, always go for the FFA, because in most of the cases you will find a very early subtle NV sitting around a normal looking fundus also. So another common indication of FFA are venous occlusive disorders. In venous occlusive disorders, usually we do it to confirm a diagnosis like a TRVO, to grade the degree of ischemia depending upon the extent of the CNPs, detect complications like macular edema, NV, and to identify areas that need laser and assess response to the treatment. Many times in cases of old CRVO, we are not very sure whether what we are looking at the disc is a disc collateral or an NVD. In that case, an FFA comes out to be very handy, which helps us to differentiate between the two and then plan our line of management. This is showing you an example of a BRVO where you can see nicely non-perfused areas along the supratemporal arcade. This is an old STBRVO. Here you can see along with the capillary non-perfusion areas, there are NVs which are leaking in the late phases, suggesting that this case needs to be treated. If you see his color photo, if you don't do an FFA, you might probably think that it's a normal looking old STBR. You might just leave it. So when in doubt, always do an FFA. Okay. Even most of the time, if I feel that the patient is affording and all, and if I see an old STBRVO, I usually advise the patient to get it done, because apart from giving us an information of these hidden NVs, it also gives us an estimation about how much of the non-perfusion areas is there, giving us an idea whether how much chance of developing an NV are there in the future. So here is an example of a hemi-CRVO. You can see almost half of the superior fundus being non-perfused and corresponding CNP areas there. This is the classical CRVO, non-ischemic obviously. Now this is a macular TRVO. Here you can see the old collaterals. This is a macular BRVO again, where you can see the area of non-perfusion just superior to the macula. Now this is an example of a CRVO, where you can see a complete non-filling of the retinal arterioles as well. And there is hardly any choroidal fluorescence also. So this is usually a classic case. Classic cases of CRVO, usually it is not, FFA is not indicated because it is classical enough to give you an idea. But when in doubt, if the patient presents to you after 3 to 4 days, or say after a week, when the cherry red spot is not so obvious, and you are not very sure whether what you're dealing with, in that case, it is good to subject the patient to an angiography. This is just an example of an FFA showing the hyperfluorescent brucines. So next most commonest indication is AMD for doing an FFA. Here we see a classic CNVM. We can see the in the late phases how the CNVM is getting filled up in what we describe as a lacy pattern. And we see the late phases, the margins becoming blurred and fuzzy, suggestive that it's leaking. Same thing here. This is more of an occult type. Again, occult CNVM. There is a macular scar with some degree of activity around that. Here we can see an RP atrophy in both the eyes and suggestive staining, which we see in the late phases, but no leakage here. So we'll be coming this to later, but just to understand what is the difference between FFA and ICG, apart from the molecular weight, the peak absorption of fluorescein is 485, while that of ICG is in the infrared range of 810 nanometers. The emission peak of fluorescein is 530, while that of ICG is 835. The protein absorption of is around 80% of fluorescein, while it is 98% in case of ICG. The ability to fluoresce is excellent for fluorescein, while it is 1/25 that in ICG. The solubility is good, while the ICG is poorly soluble. The stability in solution is more for fluorescein compared to that in ICG. And we have seen the side effect incidence is more in fluorescein compared to ICG, making ICG a more safer procedure compared to fluorescein angiography. So another one of the common indication of doing a FFA is a CSR, where we see a classic leak temporal to the macula here. This is is increasing size and intensity. The margins becoming blurred in the late phases. So this is a classic ink blot pattern of CSR. This is another type of CSR where we see a smokestack type of leak in the late phases. FFA in CSCR is to be usually done not at presentation. Usually I avoid doing it at presentation. You have to do it only when you're planning laser. So that if after 2 to 3 months of observation of the fluid still persists in OCT, in that case to do an OCT, do have to do an FFA to look for the point of leak. If you are not planning to do a laser, avoid doing an FFA because that's not going to serve you any purpose. But in that cases, OCT is more than enough to give you a diagnosis. This is an example of a chronic CSCR, which we had seen initially also, where we can see a complete RP atrophy track which is going down. This happens because the fluid gravitates because of gravity, and you can see the entire RP getting atrophied in that area, and that's why there is a window defect in that area through which you can see the background flows. So as you can see, the FFA gives us a very nice picture here in which almost an innocent looking fundus photograph. So in such cases, even though there might be no fluid at the macula, when you do the FFA, it gives you an explanation of why the patient's vision is poor because of the RP degeneration involving the macula. This is the example of pigment epithelium detachment, a PED. Here you can see this hyperfluorescence is because of pooling. So as you can see in the late phases also, there is no increase in size and the margins are also very well defined. Obviously this picture also has a which is there is a leakage here, but what I'm trying to show you is these areas of PED in this picture. One of the other indications is a parafoveal telangiectasia, where you can see in the late images there might be some little bit of leakage observed from the telangiectatic vessels. In these cases, otherwise fundus, most of the cases you might not be able to diagnose just by looking at the fundus that what is wrong with the patient. So in this case, such cases, FFA comes out to be very handy. So FFA is also useful in conditions involving the optic nerve, like in anterior-ischemic optic neuropathy. This is one of our classical FFAs where you can see a sectoral filling defect. Since you can see only a particular segment of the optic disc is well perfused, while the rest of the area remains less perfused. And obviously, clinically also you can see there is a pallid disc edema, which helps you in your diagnosis. This is also in cystoid macular edema. So you can see this flower petal type of appearance of the leakage in the late phase. Okay, so these are few of the common indications of FFA which we see in day-to-day practice. There are many other rare indications also, but I won't be going into details of all of this. The basic ones we have covered in these. So basically, to conclude, the fundus fluorescent angiography is a comprehensive, is a tool for comprehensive eye examination. It helps us in decision making, and it gives us knowledge of angiographic abnormalities and their variations in various clinical conditions. So with that, we come to the end of the first talk. Any queries or anything from the audience or from sir? Or any points to add on this?
I think we should take it after finishing
okay,
ICG
sure.
also.
Sure,
there are a few queries, but together we'll conclude.
Yeah, we'll do that. So I'll just load the next presentation. So coming with the next topic, that's an ICG. Indocyanine green was originally used in cardiac and liver function tests. It has a low sensitivity to film-based systems. That's why its use has been very limited and not as prolific as fundus fluorescent angiography. In 1986, Hayashi first used a digital fundus video angiography. And in 1990, Geyer and Yanuzzi used high-resolution digital systems for ICG procedures. In 1990, for the first time, a scanning laser ophthalmoscope-based ICG video angiography was performed, giving us very excellent quality images. So coming to the dye used in ICG, it's a tricarbocyanine water-soluble dye. It contains 5% of sodium iodide, the molecular being 775 daltons, it is excreted in liver via bile. So one basic difference what we have to understand is excretion of fluorescein is via the renal system, the kidneys, but in ICG, the excretion is via the so how does it differ from fluorescein? So the absorption and emission in infrared range, because of the obviously the larger wavelength of the emission, ICG is able to see through melanin and heme also. 98% of indocyanine green is protein bound, does not leak through choriocapillaries, and hence the ability to visualize the choroidal circulation very well. So since, as we saw, 98% of the ICG is bound, so it is hardly able to reach the choroidal circulation. So most of it gets trapped within the choroid itself, and only 2% of it is able to leave that. So that's the reason why ICG is more useful to look for choroidal conditions, to look for choroidal vascular abnormalities, while FFA is more good tool to look for retinal vascular abnormalities. So that is how you decide when you have to do an ICG and when you have to do a FFA, in case you have access to both the machines. So here we can see that in this is a graph showing that the absorption and emission of the fluorescein is between 490 and 550, while that of ICG is between 790 and 850. So going with the ICG technique, more or less the procedure and as I said, how you counsel the patient, how you prepare the patient before, all that procedure is similar to the angiography. In this procedure, 25 milligram dissolved in the solvent is injected as a bolus. Now ICG usually comes as a powder, so that has to be dissolved before injecting. ICG procedure also is divided into phases, like an early phase, a mid phase, which lasts around 8 to 12 minutes, and a late phase, which lasts around 20 to 30 minutes. One important point is that ICG is a long procedure. Usually FFA, we wind up in around 8 to 10 minutes, but in ICG, you have to look for very late frames, especially in cases like occult CNVM, IPCV, where the leakage or the hotspot or the NVs might not be visible in early frames. So you have to keep on seeing the ICG frames for 15 to as long as 20 minutes also. I, as a protocol, most of the ICGs, I keep on following till 15 minutes of dye injection. You should not end your procedure before that, because otherwise, if the hot frames, you will report it as normal because you didn't see the leak initially. As we discussed before, since the risk with the ICG dye is lesser compared to fluorescein, it is definitely a safer procedure. While it has to be cautious in patients with liver disease. As I said, it is excreted via bile into the liver. So it is, you have to be cautious in patients with hepatitis, especially the chronic hepatitis ones. It's an iodine-based dye. So if the patient is allergic to iodine, you should avoid ICG dye. Now, describing you just in a quick way, the early phases of a normal ICG. This is a very normal ICG which is done. Here you can see the dye is nicely filling the large choroidal vessels, which are very prominent here. As the time passes, this is the mid phase of the ICG. This is ICG, this is an FFA. You can see the mid phase of the ICG. You can see the larger choroidal vessels. The fluorescence is slightly reducing compared to the earlier frames. And in the late phase, you can see that almost the larger choroidal vessels are almost absent. And you can see, large hypofluorescent disc and hyperfluorescence of the retinal arteries and veins also. And a very diffuse sort of hyperfluorescence of the choroid circulation is seen. Obviously, it's a relative hyperfluorescence if you compare it with the disc. So, ICG again, it is divided into either hypofluorescence or hyperfluorescence. Hypofluorescence could be again because of blocked hypofluorescence, like blockage due to pigment, blood, or exudate, or it could be a vascular filling defect, like in a vascular occlusion or atrophy. Hypofluorescence could be pseudofluorescence, transmitted fluorescence, or because of abnormal vessels in the retinal or choroidal circulation, or it could be because of the leakage from the optic nerve or a vascular network, or from the RP or a Brooks membrane. So abnormal ICG, hyperfluorescence, not as vivid as in FFA. and the late films are more important. So always needs to be compared with the FFA. So that is also one thing which I usually do. I never perform ICG in isolation. Since you are preparing the patient in a similar way, you have taken the IV line. You most of the it is very rarely to somebody to have an ICG and not have an access to FFA. It can be the other way around. Many people have access to FFA but don't have an access to ICG. But if you have ICG in your system, you definitely will have access to FFA also. So request is to always do this procedure in conjunction with an FFA, because interpreting the ICG as a standalone is won't help you much. It will create a lot of confusion, and then later you will think of doing an FFA at a later date. So keep both the procedures, do it simultaneously. Preferably finish off your FFA first. Once the FFA is done, you can do the ICG, because ICG is definitely a longer procedure and it will take much more of your time. So if you do a longer procedure for the patient, by the time you have waited for 20 minutes, the patient is very exhausted. So I preferably make it a point of finishing my FFA, then waiting for some 15-20 minutes or half an hour, and then doing my ICG after that. So now just giving a short idea where all ICGs are done in usually, and what type of findings to expect. So ICG in macular diseases, most commonly it is done in age-related macular degeneration, in idiopathic polypoidal choroidal vasculopathy, when you're suspecting a RAP, in cases of chronic CSR, and in many inflammatory conditions and like choroiditis and all. So basically, as you can see, most of these indications are usually involving the choroid. As I said to begin with also, ICG is a procedure of choice when you're looking at any abnormality at the choroidal level. So now just going through the age-related macular degeneration, ICG is preferred in case of occult CNVM in RP detachments and in identification of feeder vessels in case of CNVM. So in ICG angiography in AMD helps us to delineate the choroidal vasculature better. It can penetrate blood and pigment, and hence helps in detection of occult CNVM. I'll be showing these things in the photo as we proceed. ICG is able to detect a CNV network in occult CNVM. A CNVM appears as a hyperfluorescent lesion in the late stages of the ICG. If this hyperfluorescent area is usually less than 1 disc diameter, it is usually termed as a hotspot on an ICG. And if it is usually more than a disc diameter size, we usually call it as a plaque, hyperfluorescent plaque. So in occult CNVM, as you can see this fundus photogram, you can see parafoveal area of hemorrhages here. This fundus photo is not very clear. It was taken in a patient with a cataract. In the other eye, you can see some macular scar-like thing. So here is an FFA which is done for the patient. Here as hemorrhage, so there is a block fluorescence here, and the scar, the corresponding hyperfluorescence in the area of the scar is there. So as you can see, the FFA is not giving us much information here. When we do an ICG for the same patient, as we see in the successive frames, that through the hemorrhages, we can see a very distinct hyperfluorescent area. And as we see in the later phases, we can see a very nice area of hyperfluorescence suggesting a hotspot. You can see this area of hyperfluorescence suggesting there is an area which is less than 1 disc diameter in size. Usually this is called as a hotspot in the late phases of an ICG. Again, another example in which you can see again a parafoveal hemorrhage here. Here the macula mora looks unremarkable. When you do an FFA, you can see the corresponding areas of hyperfluorescence there. But when you do an ICG, you can see a very nice network of neovascular fronts here. Another example here where the FFA doesn't show you as finer details as you can see. Again, you can see a nice network of neovascularization here, infratemporal to the macula on ICG. Again, an area of hemorrhage here, just inferior to the macula. FFA you again see a block fluorescence, but when you do an ICG in the late phases, you can see an area of a hotspot here. So these examples basically show you that FFA isn't of much use in cases where there is a hemorrhage sitting at the macula. It will obscure the details. But the ICG, theoretically having a longer wavelength, is able to penetrate to a greater depth, giving you more idea about the choroidal leaks, the level of the leaks at the level of the choroidal neovascularization. Same example, in the later phases, you can see a hotspot here. Again, so Sorry. So occult CNVM in when we using a digital ICG video angiography, most of the time in 61% cases we see hypofluorescent areas in the form of plaques. Focal hotspots are seen in 29% of the cases. In 8% cases there are combined lesions, while in other type of lesions are seen in around 2% of the cases. So feeder vessels, high-speed video angiography gives us a very good visualization of a feeder vessel in case of a CNVM. These are usually very nicely picked up in a very early phases of the ICG. As you can see here in the successive, here is a feeder vessel, picked up very nicely in the early phases. Now ICG, potential therapeutic options using the ICG. ICG guided photocoagulation treats CNVM identified on ICG when it is extrafoveal. So once you know the hotspot and if the area is extrafoveal, it can be treated very nicely even with a laser. Now, since ICG, we saw that the wavelength of ICGs is around 810 nanometer, while that of diode laser is also 810 nanometer. So ICG can be used for performing enhanced TTT procedure, because ICG enhanced TTT in this procedure, first ICG dye is injected and then a TTT laser is similar. It is we have a better effect on the CNVM, sparing the surrounding retina. Obviously, even same way we can use it for a feeder vessel closure. ICG can show you the feeder vessel in early phases. If outside the fovea, we can occlude it with laser whenever possible. Next commonest indication for which ICG is done is an IPCV. IPCV, there are multiple recurrent serosanguinous RP detachments. Anatomical characteristics, branching blood vessels and polyps are seen. Patients present with hemorrhagic PEDs, age and sex characteristics vary. FFA is unable to pick up these changes and ICG is diagnostic in most of the cases. So here you see, like in most of the cases when you do an FFA, there is a large subretinal bleed which might not give you much of an idea regarding where the polyps are, because most of the view is obscured. When you do an ICG, you will numerous polyps you can visualize in the late frames. So once you identify these polyps, depending upon their location, you can plan the treatment modality, whether you want to go for a PDT or a conventional laser or a TTT, or go for an intravitreal injection, depending upon the location. Now, in cases of CSR, ICG is also used in cases of chronic CSCR, especially not in fresh cases of CSCR. Usually as FFA, we see a single leak. But in cases of ICG, we can see a more widespread hyperfluorescence due to choroidal hyperpermeability in that region. This is how you see a generalized leak in ICG. As I said, ICG is also used for inflammatory conditions like choroiditis, APMPP, and weak edge syndrome. Just to give you a short idea, in APMPP, ICG, you can see marked areas of hyperfluorescence corresponding to the lesion. This hypofluorescence is seen even on the later stages of the angiogram. The late phases, the hypofluorescence persists. Same way in weak edge syndrome also, you can see multiple areas of hypofluorescent spots. These hypofluorescent spots are scattered all over the retina, and there is minimal staining. So to conclude, ICG angiography has now become an important investigation. It is different from FFA. Diagnostic role in occult CNVM, IPCV, and it enhances the understanding of many other diseases. Therapeutic role in treatment of CNVM, as its wavelength is similar to diode laser. And as I said, it should always be used in an adjunct to FFA and not as a standalone procedure. Okay, so with that, we come to an end of this session also. I think the forum is open for any questions now.
Thank you, sir. That was a very wonderful lecture. As FFA and ICG is very important in the PG exams, they do definitely get one printout where they have to read what the FFA, and then the questions are asked accordingly. Correct. So, Malpani sir, can we take questions here?
Yeah, I think this was very good. Now we should we have some time for questions. There are quite a few questions there.
Yeah.
So let me see.
What concentration of sodium fluorescein is most preferred? Question by Dr. Joshi.
Okay, so usually what we have seen in practice that if you use, there are two concentrations available. Either you can use 5 ml of 10% dye, or you can use 3% dye. Usually what I have seen that if the quantity of the dye is more concentrated, there is a more incidence of nausea. Another way, which the authors have said, that in case you want to minimize the risk of nausea and vomiting, make sure that the dye is at room temperature or it is slightly warm. If the dye is a little bit warm, means it is similar to your body temperature, the extent of nausea is less. So that is, obviously take Dr. Malpani's opinion also on this, but this is what I've seen, that the lower concentration of the dye has a low incidence of nausea and vomiting. Anything
that is right, but the problem is that it depends on the availability of the dye also.
Correct, sir. Correct.
So
correct.
Mostly I found that nowadays we have 20% only available.
3 ml. Correct, sir. Even in our PG days we used to have both of them, but
yes,
Bombay I've seen, Bombay I've seen always only 3 ml of 20% being available.
Yes, so currently that is the only thing available.
Correct, sir.
So the other question was from Dr. Anubhav, that incidence of adverse effects more with FFA or of ICG. So that I think you've already answered, but you can answer again, I think.
Yeah, obviously the as we discussed, the incidence of side effects is more with FFA, but but there's a small bias to that we are obviously doing more FFAs than we are doing ICGs, right? If you are doing equal number of ICGs compared to FFA, then probably there might have been a similar incidence. But if you ask me which dye is more toxic, I'll say fluorescein is more toxic compared to ICG.
Yeah, you have to select your patients well. You have to rule out allergies. That is most important. And you have to be careful when you are doing the procedure. You have to be alert, basically. In case of any allergy, especially vasovagal is also quite common. Otherwise, both are quite safe. And in ICG, you have to be careful about iodine allergy.
I would like to take the opportunity to welcome Dr. Anand Kumta, sir. He's been here throughout the webinar. Welcome, sir.
Oh, welcome, sir.
And we'll take the
next. Give a lot of inputs.
Yeah, sure. We are waiting.
Now the next question is for binocular condition. How is the procedure done? One eye after the other, or does the camera capture both eyes simultaneously?
Okay. I'll answer. What we practice, we are advising in FFA or we are advising in CG. If the condition which we are suspecting is affecting only one eye and the other eye is absolutely normal, you always have to start with the pathological eye first. Okay. In that case, as I said, in FFA, your early frames are very important, and in ICG, your early as well as late frames are very important. So whenever you start an FFA, always start with the pathological eye first. That doesn't mean that you have to keep looking at the pathological eye and totally ignore the other eye. But when you start with the pathological eye first, take 10 images of the pathological and just one image there, and again come back to your affected eye. But in conditions where you are suspecting a bilateral, equally susceptible, like a bilateral PDR you're suspecting, in that case, you have to take a call. You have to keep on switching from one eye to the other as you keep taking the images. But you need to prioritize. Like in one case, if I'm seeing there is a large pre-retinal hemorrhage in a PDR, and in the other case, the other eye I'm seeing that my macula is looking normal. So I know that it's a case of a PDR. But early frame, I need to see my macular status. So I'm going to concentrate on the eye where I can see the macula and not at the eye where there is a large PRH sitting. Because anyways, I'm not going to be able to see anything through the early image. So in that case, though I have a common pathology affecting both the eyes, I will concentrate on the eye where I can see the macula first and then go to the other eye. Any more inputs from Malpani, sir?
No, the only thing is that you can take picture of one eye at a time only, not both eyes simultaneously.
Correct, sir.
Yeah. So another question was that the difference between pooling and staining and when it should be seen. Staining should be commented only in slides of late phases only. The difference between pooling and staining, and should staining be commented only in late phases?
Yeah, staining you don't have to wait for very long. So staining usually you will start seeing after 3 to 4 minutes also. The main pooling and staining, usually staining you will not have it in isolation. You can't have a lesion which stains and which looks absolutely normal on a clear fundus picture. So you have to see it in conjunction with your color fundus photograph. And pooling wise, as I said, it will increase in size and it will not increase in size, and it will be very well defined. So you have to keep looking the late images. But pooling you will see it very early. You might see it at 2 minutes also, and the lesion will remain exactly the same at the end of 8 minutes also. But staining, you might see it around 3 to 4 minutes, and you might see that the image is becoming a little bit more hyperfluorescent in the late stages. But the margins might not be as well defined as compared. Any other questions?
Yeah, there's another question about block fluorescence versus CNP areas. I think Dr. Kumta has explained it. I'd request him to just explain it.
Yeah.
He has given a very good explanation.
Yeah, so whenever you see an area of hypofluorescence, it could either be an area of block fluorescence, or it could be an area of vascular filling defect. So basically what you need to do is to compare it to the fundus picture or the red free picture. And if that area of hyperfluorescence exactly matches in this the shape, size, and location to the area of any blocking material seen on the fundus picture, like for example, periretinal hemorrhage or a retinal hemorrhage, then you assume that it is block fluorescence. And if it follows the territory of the vasculature, then it's a vascular filling defect, and you don't have any corresponding blocking material on the fundus pic. Any other pointers from you all?
I'll concur with sir what sir is saying.
Yeah, I think you explained quite well. And that's what Dr. Sarvesh also had said, that always look at the color picture also. Don't just look at FFA and start diagnosing the condition or commenting about it.
In cases of monoocular pathology, after what interval the pictures are taken?
In case of a monoocular pathology, usually, as I said, take the early frames, let your ratios of the photo be around 10:1. If you are absolutely sure that the other eye is 6:6 and there is no pathology in that eye, concentrate on the pathology eye first. In between, you take one photo in the early phase, take one in the mid and one in the late. I usually follow that pattern. I usually don't waste taking time of too many pics for the normal eye. You can do that way.
There's another question that I think you've already answered, but you can answer once again. That the best time to look for macular ischemia in FAZ?
As I said in the early pictures, in the early first 1 to 2 minutes only, you have to, after injection of the dye, the early pics will give you a very nice idea of the size and the distortion of the FAZ.
I saw a couple of questions on IRMA on FFA. How do you differentiate IRMA from an NVE?
Definitely, IRMAs will not leak on FFA. The NVEs will leak.
Correct.
So clinically, there might be a confusion differentiating between the two, but the FFA is a sure shot way. If the FFA, there is no leakage seen on late frames, be sure it's an IRMA and not an FFA you're looking at. Or if it's a case of a CRV or something, you're looking at a discolateral and it is not an NVD. That is the way you differentiate between them.
Yeah. Another question is, what is cause of smoke stick pattern in CSR?
I think sir can explain that better.
Basically, I think the difference is because of the osmotic pressure between the subretinal fluid and the fluorescein dye. Because of that, it rises up. So it gives an appearance of smoke stick appearance in that. And there's a difference between pseudophakic macular edema versus diabetic macular edema.
I didn't get the question, sir.
The question is, how do you differentiate a pseudophakic macular edema versus diabetic macular edema?
See, as I said,
macular edema versus diabetic macular edema.
Yeah. So I just say what usually I follow, that post-operative. I'm suppose you're asking this question on an angiographic way.
Yes.
No?
Yes.
Yeah. So in that case, obviously you have to see the patient's color fundus photo and match it. If definitely the patient is not a diabetic, we are assuming that here the patient is diabetic. Okay. So if you are seeing any hemorrhages along with hard exudates and all, then it's a clear-cut thing that what you're dealing with is a diabetic macular edema. But in case where you not seeing any hard exudates around them, there is no clinically significant macular edema, and you are in confusion, then you, I think you can take help from the late phases. You can see a flower petal appearance of leakage in a pseudophakic macular edema. But one thing which I usually, even I get confused is, what if it's in a diabetic patient with a CSME, which was initially well, and post-operative you see an edema. So whether you label it as a pseudophakic edema, or whether it's a diabetic edema which has got exacerbated post-cataract surgery. That is one thing which I'll I'll take opinion of Dr. Kumta or Malpani sir to answer that question.
Yeah, Dr. Kumta, your opinion, please.
Yeah, so very often both the conditions are present in the same patient. Like diabetic macular edemas often get worsened after cataract surgery, and in such a situation you have a diabetic CSME with superimposed CME. Broadly, I would say that if you have leaking microaneurysms on the fluorescent angiogram, or like a dilated capillary bed involving the entire posterior pole, it would be more of a diabetic macular edema. In a pseudophakic CME, you will get only flower petal leakage only in the foveal area, and not extending. The leakage would not be extended beyond that. And very often you would also get like a hot disc, like the classic Irvine gas syndrome.
Correct.
But I think very often both the conditions are present simultaneously, and sometimes they're a little difficult, but I think treatment-wise it will not make that much of a difference, because what do you say, Anupam and Sarvesh?
Yeah, I think, see, if the patient is non-diabetic, then you don't have any problem.
Correct.
It is very clear. If patient is diabetic, then depending on how many microorganisms, how they are behaving, then mostly it will be a combination if the patient has been operated very recently.
Correct.
If it's a long-standing pseudophakia, then I don't think that would play an important role. Okay. And as you rightly said, the disc also will give some idea about this.
Yeah, correct.
Another thing I have seen, a couple of people have asked how to describe FFA during examination.
During examination, I didn't get the question. You mean to say how to report an FFA?
I think so, yeah. I think they mean that.
Yeah. So basically, when we are when I'm teaching PG students, those DOMS students, when I tell them how to report, what I usually tell them that when you are given an angiograph in your hand, so basically an angiography given in a hand is usually not will be an isolated photo, but it will be a series of photos. So you have to first see which eye you are looking at. You have to describe that what phase of angiogram you are looking at, and then as we said, then you start describing the lesion. Start from first the vascular arcades, describe the macula. You see whether the lesion is a hypofluorescent one or a hyperfluorescent one. Then again, if it's a hyperfluorescent one, then whether the margins are well defined. How is the hyperfluorescence progressing along with the FFA? Is it increasing in size? Whether increasing in intensity? Whether it is remaining the same? So that is how you describe. So by giving, and plus obviously you have to keep a photo, clinical fundus photo in the side when you're describing the FFA. Never describe the FFA in isolation without the fundus photograph. You have to see the fundus photograph, and as you gradually explain the FFA, you come to a diagnosis. You lead the examiner towards the diagnosis by describing your findings in that direction. Any other views from others?
There's another question. I think Dr. Kumta would be the best person to answer this. Can you please suggest a book to follow and learn regarding FFA and OCT?
I think Shankar Netralaya
yes,
Atlas of Fluorescent Angiography is very, very good.
Comprehensive,
yeah. And OCT, I think Dr. Amod Gupta and Vishali Gupta. There are many other books as well. And
Indian books, so I think cost-wise they'll be less expensive, and they'll deal with Indian patients.
Yeah. So I think that there are many atlases which are exceedingly good, like the Shankar Netralaya atlases, for retina, then for neuro-ophthal, for for various condition, subspecialties. I think they are extremely good, and I would recommend them very strongly to all the PGs.
And there's been one question from Dr. Ralph from somebody has asked that do we need to perform a skin sensitivity test done prior to FFA? So when we were taught doing an FFA at that time in Arvind, we used to always do a skin sensitivity test. But nowadays, most of the places I don't do it. I will ask to take Dr. Kumtaz and Malpani sir's opinion also, whether you all do sensitivity test prior to FFA in your practice.
No, I don't do.
Yeah.
What I do is I inject a very small test dose to see if the patient is allergic to the dye. I think most of us do it. And the only one thing I would like to say about this procedure is that we must never do it without an anesthetist. We should always have a pulse oximeter in place. We should always check the blood pressure. We should have adrenaline, atropine loaded. The oxygen cylinder should be checked.
Yeah.
We should have the everything should be kept ready, including an endotracheal tube and the laryngoscope, because you never know when you can land up in a problem. And if you get symptoms immediately, it could either be a vasovagal, or you will get a very early indication by looking at the pulse rate on the pulse oximeter. And sometimes if you suddenly start getting itching or some lesions appearing in the skin within the first 1 minute, then it could be an anaphylactic reaction. And having managed a patient who was collapsing and with an anaphylactic reaction, I know that it's a real thing.
Yeah.
And it's not to be taken lightly. I've had a patient who had a cerebrovascular accident during the FFA. About 10 minutes later, he started vomiting and then eventually died 2-3 days later. Luckily, it didn't happen at the same time. I would have been in trouble. But just to tell you that angiography is not, it's not an innocuous procedure, and we should not take it lightly. Any other comments from Anupam?
Anupam sir, can I add? Yeah, I was just about to say the same points. The students should know management of vasovagal attack and anaphylactic attack, because that can be the next question after reading an FFA. A sugar pallet or a sugar powder should be kept ready, because these patients would be fasting. Before starting the FFA, fundus photos, autofluorescence, montage photos should be completed, so that also helps the patient know how to look in which all directions, and even the optometrist gets used to the patient, whether he is fast or slow in his responses. Anesthetic, as sir told, has to be there. Patency of IV line, anesthetic is going to check, but you have to double check, ask him. Timer is very important. It should go right at the time when the dye has been injected, and the timer is the same even if we are doing one eye at a time and the second eye. So the watch on the timer is very important. And a vomiting bag has to be kept ready, a disposable bag, because if the patient is going to vomit, he is going to damage your instruments. And so the disposable vomiting bag should be ready. And first sign which I have noted, though not all patients have an attack, but many of them start lifting their head and chin and start going backwards as they have that nauseating feeling. So look out for that reflex from the patient when the patient is going back. And now in this COVID era, I think we should do autofluorescence, OCTA if possible, or OCT to diagnose the patients, especially in this COVID era. Don't try and do all FFA unless it is absolutely required.
Absolutely. And one more thing which I would like to share with everybody is that even in the Arvind days when we were doing sensitivity tests, very few times I've seen that even if has been no sensitivity on skin test, but still the patient used to get a reaction when the dye was injected. I'm not really sure whether actually giving a test dose really makes any sense, because even in patients who were normal, they suddenly had urticaria and reaction when the dye was pushed in. So either we were not waiting for enough time before we started the procedure, or whether the dose which was injected was too small to incite any allergic reaction in the patient, I feel. So that's my take on it. So I don't know.
Practically what I've seen is in all patients, I ask them to take Cetirizine and Domstal 1 hour before they come. And in my practice, I have hardly ever had any patient vomiting at the time of doing FFA. So all patients, and very few reactions till now. I hope that it doesn't happen now next time. But in last 25 years, this is what I have seen. Any other questions are there?
Sarvesh, give them a simple clue. The first thing to start a Viva, how will they identify whether this is a FFA or a ICG plate?
Yeah, that
That's
is
one thing which you always look at. Give them that clue that at least their start of the answer has to be easy, whether it is a ICG plate or a FFA plate. Tell them the trick.
So usually, I think Kumta sir and Malpani sir have taken a lot of DOMS exams. They'll be the best person to answer these questions.
I have never taken.
I think I have a glance at the optic disc.
Yeah.
Through all the images, if it is looking dark,
yeah, that
more often
he has
than not,
already
it is the ICG.
ICG.
Yeah.
This point he has already told them.
Mentioned.
Usually we usually what I have seen giving in exams, usually they give you a series of pictures. They will not give you a single photo and tell you to diagnose a condition. Usually they give you a 9-up or a 12-up picture and tell you to diagnose that way. So one of the points which you have given is very correct. Like look at the optic disc. If it's dark, it's an ICG, and if it's like especially in the late stages, and if it is very bright, then that means it's a FFA. And obviously, you also have to look at circulation, how you are seeing. In the retinal circulation is more prominent, that means it's an FFA. But in the early stages, if you see large choroidal vessels which are very prominent, that means it's an ICG. And definitely, nowadays the clarity part doesn't come much into play because you have SLO-based ICGs where you get fantastic pictures. So it's not that the FFAs are very clear and the ICGs are very blurry. That no longer stays because of the SLO-based pictures. So any more questions from anybody in the audience?
Have we covered all the queries which were there?
Yeah, most of them.
Most of them have been covered.
All questions are covered.
Yeah.
So any closing remarks, Anupam sir?
No, as he has already covered most of the important things, the only thing now is that FFA during our time was the only procedure we had in hand. Now there are so many other procedures available, like OCT, angio. ICG, of course, has never picked up because the quality of images, the difficulty in diagnosis, and limited applicability, because the equipment itself is very expensive. But it does have a role to play in certain conditions, especially the pachychoroid spectrum. There, ICG has a very important role to play. FFA also has important role. It's not that it is totally outdated, especially in diabetics. We do use it quite frequently. And in CSR, if you have to do the treatment at that time, it also plays an important role. That's all I think. All other things we have already covered in question answers, the procedure, the side effects.
Okay, so I
Thank
think
you everybody.
Sarvesh, thank you everybody.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
And you're already getting
Thank
good
you, Dr.
compliments.
Kumta, for sparing time today.
Yeah.
Kumta sir has been guiding us since 6 o'clock.
6
Yes,
o'clock.
I know. I missed
No,
that.
very nice session, and you end up every session that you attend, you end up learning something new.
Yes, yes.
Absolutely, sir.
And learning is a never-ending process. I mean,
Yeah.
I think we should learn till the end.
And I think so we should give a special thanks to Swapnesh and Pritam sir, for organizing this excellent
PG sessions and this webinars.
They are the ones who have the most nicely utilized this lockdown period. Everybody's going to become polished once the lockdown is over.
I'm worried
the best
about
thing is
them.
they're available on YouTube also. So
No, I'm worried about them because it is very stressful. They have to plan everything,
I know.
the topics, think about the topics.
So it is very stressful when there is a non-retina, non-uvea session.
No, that is easy. You can give to someone else.
Yeah.
But what? There's nothing to contribute. You have to listen. But
listen.
That's right.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you.
So much.
Sumit just announced.
So thank you, sir, for your time. And Saturday we have a next class. It's on the basic squint evaluation. That is one of the most scared topic and the case that we have in the exam. So Dr. Hemalini Samant ma'am will be explaining it case wise and the basic of squint evaluation. So Saturday 8 o'clock we'll meet again. Thank you, Sarvesh sir. Thank you, Anand.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.
With your permission, can I end the meeting?
Yes.
Yeah, sure. Sumit,
Yeah,
thank you very much for recording.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.